Welcome to the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective. I'm Tony Aguilar. On today's podcast, why does an income and wealth gap persist and continue to grow between different racial and ethnic groups in the United States and around the world? Some say that traditional economic theories serve to maintain the status quo and are inadequate to explain the reasons or to provide solutions to this growing wealth chasm. Can an economic theory called stratification economics serve to address this persistent and growing wealth inequality? Next. William Darity Jr. is the Samuel Du Bois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African and African American Studies and Economics, and the director of the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke University. He was the founding director of the Research Network on Racial and Ethnic Inequality at Duke University, and Dr. Darity also served as a visiting scholar for the Russell Sage Foundation, the National Humanities Center, and the Federal Reserve's Board of Governors. He is a recipient of the National Economic Association's Samuel Z. Westerfield Award, which is the organization's highest honor. He has published or edited 13 books and published more than 3,300 articles in professional outlets. His most recent book, co-authored with A. Kirsten Mullen, is From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. Dr. Darity, I am honored to have you here with me this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
Let me ask you this. As we look at what has been deemed stratification economics, of which you are the one who named it, and you are indeed one of the founders of stratification economics, how does it differ from classical economics?
Well, I think conventional economics tends to focus on the idea that people are seeking happiness through the accumulation of absolute amounts of various types of goods and services, that they value having larger amounts of things. And stratification economics says, well, yes, they may well value having larger amounts of things, but they're also concerned about their relative position. And they're concerned about their relative position in two different ways. One way is they're concerned about their relative position vis-a-vis their peers, but they're also concerned about the relative position of the social groups with which they identify. And so, sort of the trigger for thinking about this importance of the attachment to social identity groups really emerges out of my own focus on issues concerning racial disparities in the United States, but is also informed by other types of disparities that exist on a global basis. So, for example, caste inequality in India, or religious divisions and disparities in Northern Ireland. So stratification economics is really concerned and focused on the question of how people identify with particular social groups and what the consequences are of those identifications, particularly in terms of the creation of inequalities across these social groups.
As part of, if you decrease it down to its initials, SE, part of it also is a rejection of the notion of behavioral components adding to a community's position via wealth and income. That is something that you tend to reject, correct?
That's correct. If we think about variations in outcomes across individuals, we certainly might think that these are things that could be tied to differences in motivation, differences in energy, differences in attitudes towards various kinds of goals and accomplishments. But if we start talking about social groups, variations in behavior, in motivation, and the like, do not satisfactorily explain the huge disparities that we observe. And in fact, I would even argue more strongly, they don't tell us anything of importance about those kinds of disparities, that we have to look at the question of the relationships between social groups with respect to power and authority.
So, in essence, you would be saying that the notion of where people are collectively, not individually, but collectively,
Yeah.
is a function of a social construct. And if you take it in the United States, it's whether through slavery, segregation, redlining, and the like. Would I be correct in surmising that?
Yes, that's right. That would be you've identified a set of policies that are fundamental to the creation of the kinds of disparities we observe today between blacks and whites in the United States. And you could do something similar. I mentioned as a parallel example, caste disparity in India. You could do something similar in terms of looking at the historical array of policies that have been pursued to the advantage of the high caste in India and to the disadvantage of the lower caste, and especially the subcaste group of the Dalits or untouchables in India.
You go even further um, in saying that traditional economic theory actually maintains status quo because it is based on a desire to keep people where they are. Because if you look at traditional economic theory, when I was going to school back in the 60s, we had you work hard, you do this, so forth and so on. But none of it ever took into consideration what was going on in terms of legal systems, uh, real estate, redlining, and all of that stuff. So it seems to me you're trying to do what James Cone did in theology and to kind of move what is traditional German theologian concepts not not away, but to have it compete with something, that there was a different way of looking at this.
Well, I definitely think one of my motives for working on the development of stratification economics was to provide a framework that is different from the one that I was brought up in as a young economist, and it's because I became increasingly convinced that framework for trying to understand what's going on in the world was inadequate, and we needed something different. And so
Yes.
stratification economics became the organ to try to think about the world in a way that I think is more consistent with the circumstances that we're actually experiencing.
Stratification economics also proposes various solutions to the issue of wealth gap and income gap. Could you say more about that? For example, baby
Well,
bonds.
so I think maybe I depart from some of the other scholars who are working in the stratification economic space on this. It's not clear to me that the theoretical apparatus of stratification economics tells us what we should do. I think it's more useful in telling us how difficult it would be to adopt the policies that would truly bring about transformative change. To the extent that there's a dominant social group that's committed to maintaining its position of advantage, it's going to resist any type of policy that causes some kind of deterioration in its relative position. And so that makes it very, very hard to move in the direction of transformative change in societies where there's a high degree of intergroup disparity. And so I'm not so sure that stratification economics tells us what we should do, but it does provide us with a means of trying to evaluate how challenging it will be to get from here to there if we're trying to produce a more equitable society.
Part of that, in terms of the difficulty of stratification economics, you've been trying to get SE designated as a subset of economics. And that's been difficult. I think they've put it under a broader category. But what would it do to have SE designated as a subset of economics? What would be the power behind that, and what would be the consequence of that?
So the American Economic Association actually has a series of categories of subfields in economics that are designated in the association's Journal of Economic Literature. And a few years ago, Gregory Price and I made an effort to try to get stratification economics to be listed as one of the subfields. So there's a host of these subfields: macroeconomics, economic history, history of economic thought, environmental economics, and so on. So we thought that stratification economics should have its own category. And what they ultimately did was put us into a category which they call economic stratification, as opposed to stratification economics. And they put it under alphabet letter Z, which is the last one in the series. But I'm hopeful that we can push for an improved recognition of the position of stratification economics in that listing. And one of the other positives that we have underway at the present moment is the fact that we're in negotiations for the development of a journal of stratification economics. And there's some other things that have occurred that have been encouraging in terms of consolidation of the field, especially the fact that there's an array of scholars in other parts of the world who are engaging explicitly in stratification economics, particularly in India, in the UK. And there's actually a scholar from the continent who is located in Iceland who is doing work on stratification economics. Very good work as well. So
Now, what would happen? How would it empower you and others in this field if it is designated as an actual subset? And would it also help you all to try to influence the political conversation around economics, not only in the United States, but around the world?
well, it's always helpful if you're engaged in the process of trying to develop a new subfield in economics for it to be given the credibility as a recognized subfield. So that's always useful. It also provides an avenue for researchers who are seeking advancement in the profession to say that they're doing stratification economics and for it to be a recognized subfield with the requisite degree of prestige that could be associated with working in that area. So there is a professional political dimension to getting full recognition of the subfield. And so that would be empowering. It would not be the last thing that needs to be done, but it would certainly be a very valuable step.
Now, your theory of economics, stratification economics, has also been criticized. Not everyone is on board with that. People from, I think one of your colleagues, John Stanton, has written against it. Thomas Sowell, from what I've read of his, would be opposed to your theory. I don't know where Glenn Lowry would be on that, but because they do push the behavioral aspect
Right.
of a group's position. So how do you respond to them? Now they do speak to a particular audience, which is tends to be conservative. So, what's
Well,
your response to them?
yeah. So I think that their position is that if we observe these sharp intergroup differences, that they're somehow connected to cultural differences. Um, I don't think that these three individuals, well, I'm not sure about Staten, but I don't think that either Sowell or Lowry would say that this is something that is genetically driven. But Staten might. I mean, he's a psychologist, so who knows? But they all would say that there's some kind of cultural difference between the group on the top and the group on the bottom, and that this has implications for the kinds of inequalities that we observe. And my argument is, if we just go down the list of the types of disparities that you might observe, we can demonstrate that they're not attributable to some kind of behavioral difference between the groups, that there's clearly a very different set of explanations that have to be pulled into the narrative. And just as one illustration, if we think about wealth differences by race, and those are substantial. I think as of the 2019 survey of consumer finances, it's been estimated that the average white household has approximately $841,000 in net worth, more than the average black household. Well, you can't explain that on the basis of any kind of educational differences or attitudes towards education. So, to illustrate my point, the median black head of household with a college degree has 2/3 of the net worth of the median white household head who never finished high school. And to go further on that point, black Americans are more inclined to get education than white Americans. And most people don't realize this, but if you control for household income, black American youth are more likely to get more years of schooling and to earn more degrees than white youths who are from families with similar levels of income. So there's, if anything, the motivational dimension is reversed when you start thinking about education. And so that doesn't explain it. And so I could go down the line on a number of ways in which people try to explain wealth differences or other types of differences, and make a very strong case that the behavioral dimension doesn't explain what's going on.
Also, help us understand the exact pushback against what you're trying to do. And by that, I mean, if you look historically, no one can argue that there was slavery in the country. That's an historical fact. So no one can argue about segregation. No one can argue about some of the laws that were race based that were designed to keep people in certain areas. So, and you were just talking about John Staten. One of the things that Staten points out, he says, well, nothing since the 60s in terms of laws have been race based to keep Black people back or in other groups. My critique of that is, let's say that's true, which is not, but then you forget the other 400 years that came before the 1960s. And so there seems to be a desire to try to erase history and to say, well, we're only going to start from this time period. So, what's behind all that? Because I would also use that critique with Dr. Soul and Dr. Lowry. So, but what is behind that?
I think that these individuals are minimizing the intergenerational consequences of particular waves of deficits. Now, that's kind of unusual. It's interesting in the case of Glenn Lowry, because his initial doctoral dissertation was about intergenerational effects. But I guess when you come to the point of thinking about disparities today, all of these individuals as critics of stratification economics, or critics more broadly of the notion that racism is an important consideration in this world, are really ignoring intergenerational transmission effects. So the fact that something occurred in 1950 can have repercussions across generations, and they can have significant repercussions across generations. And I've been very, very much focused on wealth, because wealth is something that's cumulative and it's transmitted intergenerationally, not just through inheritances, but also through these things that we call in vivo transfers, where the donor is still living and they make a gift to a member of the younger generation. And these gifts can take a variety of forms. They could be enabling the younger person to come out of college without any student debt, or they could be the provision of a car when you graduate from high school, or it could be that parents or grandparents provide help for a newly married couple when they purchase their first home, that they get support from the family in making the down payment for the mortgage. They might be given a home in some instances. If the family is sufficiently wealthy, they might be given a business to take over if the family has such an arrangement. And so we have to think intergenerationally about the accumulation of wealth. And there are huge racial differences in the resources that previous generations of Black Americans have had that they could transmit to the subsequent generations. And that's a consequence in large measure because of the types of social policies that have been pursued in the United States. It's not because of different attitudes towards wealth accumulation. And in fact, if we think about savings behavior, again, if you control for household income, there's no evidence that Blacks save less than whites. And in fact, in some income categories, there is evidence that Blacks actually have a higher savings rate than whites. So, we need to move entirely away. We need to do, the phrase that I used in one of my papers is, we need to do bypass surgery on these cultural deterministic types of arguments.
I know you talked about stratification economics not necessarily having the solution of issues like wealth disparity, but you are a proponent of, let's say, reparations, and you are a proponent, I believe, of baby bonds. And while these are compensatory and not necessarily socially transformative, but they would serve a purpose. Um, what do you think reparations would do in its compensatory phase?
Well, so I actually think both of these policies do have the potential to be transformative. What stratification economics would tell me is that it would be easier in principle to adopt a baby bonds proposal than it would be to adopt a reparations proposal. And the reason is the baby bonds proposal is one that's universal. And so as a consequence, you would be providing it to not only Black newborn Black children, but you'd be providing it to all children in the United States. Now, you would structure it in such a way that the amount that is put into a trust account for a child would be contingent on their parents' wealth position. And so to the extent that Black families are generally less wealthy than white families, then there could be the potential for a disproportionate benefit for Black children. And so this could affect over time, and it would take at least 30 to 40 years for the full effects to become evident. This could affect over time the relative wealth position of whites versus Blacks. But it would not result in an absolute deterioration of the white wealth position. Now, on the other hand, if we start thinking about reparations, We could design reparations in such a way that we did not take money from whites and transfer it to blacks. There are other procedures for funding reparations that don't involve some kind of tax and transfer mechanism. But you definitely would alter the relative position of white Americans with respect to wealth. And so the question becomes, is there a point at which this desire to preserve relative position can be overcome? And so stratification economics doesn't tell us, oh, let's adopt baby bonds or let's adopt reparations. But it does tell us, if you try to go those routes, here are some of the obstacles that you're going to be faced with. And here's the kinds of political questions that would have to be addressed to move effectively in those directions. So I think both of these policies have transformative power. I think reparations has immense transformative power. It potentially could provide Black Americans for the material condition for full citizenship in the United States, a condition that Black Americans have never had. But I think both would be difficult to achieve, although I think the baby bonds proposal, given its universal character, might be politically more palatable at first blush.
But you have said that there is a way to do reparations without there being this transfer, taking from one to give to the other. What would be some of the ways in which you would do that if it
Well,
came
so
to
the
that?
federal government, it's only the federal government that could do it because the federal government is a sovereign currency issuer. The federal government simply could make payments, direct payments to eligible recipients, and it could do so without increasing taxes, largely in a manner that's similar to what the federal government did in response to the Great Recession in 2007, 2008. And similar to the way in which the federal government put forth funding to respond to the pandemic. So in both cases, substantial amounts of money were issued without there being an increase in taxes. The danger that you're confronted with in those situations is the potential of triggering substantial inflation. So you have to design the program in such a way that you mitigate the inflationary effects. But you do not have to take money out of white pockets and put them into Black pockets, which is the way in which many, many people think about how a reparations plan should be executed. And again, if you did it through a tax and transfer mechanism from whites to Blacks, then that would be politically more challenging to do than if you could do it in such a way in which you could raise the Black wealth position without necessarily reducing white resources.
I'm responding to what you're just saying in terms of the reaction, because I do remember in 2008, after the Great Recession, when President Obama made a proposal to forgive some mortgage debt. And I remember some of the reaction by folks. CNBC, Rick Santelli in particular, had a fit. I mean, the reaction to that was overwhelming. And so, but we have incidences of where reparations have been paid in the United States. So it's not something that has never occurred. With Asian Americans, for example, we're seeing it, I think, a little bit in Florida
Well,
in
it's
terms
not Asian Americans writ large. It's specifically Japanese
Japanese,
Americans.
yes, Japanese. So we have seen that. But my question to you, given the political difficulty of that, are there now discussions with people within the political realm around the issue of stratification economics? I mean, are those discussions taking place?
I'm not aware of that. I mean, there are discussions about the various kinds of policies we've been talking about, including reparations. But I'm not so certain that policymakers are really talking to any significant degree about stratification economics. There are some think tanks based in Washington, D.C., like the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, that have produced working papers and reports on stratification economics. And I think to some degree it's informing the kind of research and policy actions that they're pursuing. But I'm not aware of elected officials who are talking about stratification economics.
So, given your background and you're one of the more prominent economists in the nation, is this an apt time to really begin that conversation? We're entering into an election season. You do have other voices out there who are not themselves politicians, but Dr. Cornel West, for example, would obviously be open to something like stratification economics. There are other politicians in New York City, for example, Alexandria Ocasio Cortez would be open to something like that. So, how does a conversation like that begin, and who should be leading that conversation?
Well, I actually think that the fact that there are some think tanks that are in particular Washington based that are taking the idea of stratification economics very seriously. Well, I mean, another that's not Washington based, but it's New York City based, the Roosevelt Institute has done a substantial amount of work that's related to stratification economics, and they've had me write some stuff for them that's related to stratification economics. And I think it's at that level that you have the opportunity to push it into a conversation that's taking place among elected officials. So I think we're close. We're almost there at the moment.
So, if we take stratification economics, I implement it, tell me what you would see a decade down the line that it's taken seriously, it's become a subset, it's entered into the political realm. In particular, let's start with the United States. How do you think the African American community in general would be affected by this? Obviously, in a positive way. What do you think would happen? And then I want to talk about potential global implications of stratification economics.
So I think that although it's not clear to me that stratification economics points us towards specific policies, it does point us away from some policies. So to the extent that stratification economics rejects behavioral explanations for intergroup differences, then it wipes out a set of policies that focus on behavior. And so we could then think about ways in which we transform the degree of equity and fairness in American society that goes beyond thinking about how we change the actions of particular social groups rather than changing the circumstances and conditions that they're confronted with. So I think that would be a very important shift. And it would be a very important shift in the context of the national conversation about intergroup disparities. But I'm not sure beyond that what could be expected as a product of stratification economics.
But you are laying out something that's very monumental because I think, at least as I see it, if stratification economics becomes part of the mainstream, you would be, in essence, supplanting kind of the Milton Friedman school of thought that defines a lot of economists today. And that's that classical, traditional personal agency and the like. And so that is a very important step, as you were saying, which shift the conversation. But also, you don't just think that it's going to have something to do simply for the United States, but that it has global implications as well, because there's been a number of papers that have been written, whether from Bangladesh or Brazil and other places. What are the global implications of this?
Well, I think in a global context, in other countries where you observe these kinds of group-based differences, you also observe arguments being made that they're a consequence of different cultural orientations or different behavioral orientations between the groups. So you've got the same sort of arguments being made there. And to the extent that stratification economics catches hold in other contexts, then it makes it possible to confront those kinds of arguments and those same kinds of arguments in other settings and locations.
Are you optimistic over, let's say, the next 5 to 10 years that stratification economics will become part of the mainstream discussion of economics?
Well, I think that there's momentum in that direction, and I never can say what will ultimately happen, but yeah, I mean, I introduced the phrase stratification economics in 2005, so that's 18 years ago. So we're coming up towards the 20th anniversary of the naming of stratification economics as a field. And there are more, there's much more activity surrounding stratification economics than there ever has been before. A year ago, the Journal of Economic Literature had a symposium that was primarily devoted to stratification economics. There have been issues of other journals that have been devoted to stratification economics. There are now some encyclopedia type entries in the economics field that include stratification economics. You mentioned the criticism from John Statton, which was published the American, it was AIER, the American Institute for Economic Research, which is kind of one of these more right-wing oriented organizations. I think the fact that he paid attention and actually wrote a critique means that there's some that stratification economics has some legs, and so yeah, I would say I'm optimistic about what's evolving. And if I could tell you in 5 years that there was also a Journal of Stratification Economics and we had a higher classification on the Journal of Economic Literature codes, then I would think we were in a pretty good position in terms of the impact of the subspecialty.
My guest today has been Dr. William Darity, distinguished economist and the Samuel Dubois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African and African American Studies at Duke University. And I was honored to have him here today as my special guest. Dr. Darity, thank you for being with me today.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed it.
And thank you for listening. And join us again next week as we feature another issue of global interest and importance here on the Aguilar Conversations, A Global Perspective.
The Aguilar Conversations, A Global Perspective, is produced by Casa Margo Communications Group.